The empire was dying. Its domes still shimmered in the sunlight, its mosques still echoed with prayer. But beneath the call to worship, there was silence, the silence of decline. Gone were the days when the thunder of Ottoman armies shook the world, when Hurrem Sultan's laughter echoed through Topkapi's corridors, when the empire was young, and its pulse was fire. Now the fire had dimmed, but it was not gone. It lingered, flickering like the dying embers of a once great hearth, in the hearts of women who refused to let the legacy of Hürrem fade into dust. It began with the fall of power itself. The Valide Sultans, once the hidden rulers of the empire, saw their influence wane as Europe surged ahead, their ships faster, their guns deadlier, their ideas more dangerous. But inside the imperial harem, a different battle was unfolding. A battle not of soldiers but of survival, not of nations, but of memory. Each woman who entered those walls knew the stories of those who came before. They whispered Hürrem's name like a prayer. They remembered Kosim's wisdom, Turhan's steel, Nurbanu's cunning. They knew that even as the empire weakened, the blood of queens still flowed, unseen but unbroken. In 1808, when the young Sultan Mahmud II ascended the throne, the empire was already trembling. Wars with Russia had torn its borders apart, corruption rotted its core, and revolts rose like storms from every corner. But within the walls of the harem, another force was stirring, a woman who would become both the protector and conscience of a dying dynasty. Her name was Hurrem Sultan. Born a Georgian slave, she rose to become the consort of Mahmud II and later the Valide Sultan to his son. She was unlike any woman the empire had seen since Hürrem herself. Pious yet progressive, soft-spoken yet unyielding, Hurrem ruled not through fear or seduction, but through wisdom. When plague swept through Istanbul, it was she who opened the palace gates to the sick. When the poor starved, it was she who fed them. When the empire stumbled toward modernity, it was she who guided it forward, quietly, invisibly, but with the hand of destiny. Under her influence, hospitals were built, schools established, charities founded. Her name adorned the great Hürrem Gureba Hospital, a sanctuary for those forgotten by the empire, proof that even in its twilight, the Ottoman world still had room for mercy. Foreign ambassadors, accustomed to seeing Valide sultans as relics of a decadent past, wrote of her with awe. They called her the Mother of the Nation, a title once reserved only for Hürrem. Yet Hürrem knew, as Hürrem once had, that power always demands a price. For every act of compassion, there were enemies whispering behind silk curtains. As her son's reforms deepened, abolishing slavery and modernizing the empire, the old guard turned against her. They called her dangerous, a woman who thought too much, spoke too freely, who dared to shape the destiny of men. But Hürrem only smiled. "Let them fear me," she is said to have replied. Hürrem's daughters have always been feared. When she died in 1853, the empire mourned as if a queen had fallen, the streets of Istanbul filled with the poor who had once eaten from her hand. The palace grew dim with grief, and in her mosque, candles flickered as if the flame of Hürrem herself had bowed in respect. But with her passing, the empire entered its darkest century. The very reforms that had promised salvation now tore the state apart. Revolts in the Balkans, wars with Russia, and the ambitions of Europe broke the Ottomans like waves breaking upon a shore. And in the midst of that chaos, another woman stepped from the shadows. Pertevniyal Sultan, the last great Valide of the old world. She was of Circassian blood, a woman of striking beauty and fierce devotion. When she became the Valide Sultan to her son Abdulaziz, the empire was on the edge of collapse. Pertevniyal ruled with silence and poise. Her palace rose like a jewel in Aksaray, a fusion of Ottoman grace and European elegance. She was devout yet modern, traditional yet pragmatic, embodying the impossible balance of an empire torn between East and West. When foreign dignitaries visited Istanbul, it was she, not her ministers, who understood diplomacy's hidden language. But the world around her was changing too fast. The sons of the empire no longer looked to their mothers for counsel. They looked to Paris, to London, to Vienna. They borrowed debt, weapons, and dreams, and forgot the wisdom of their own blood. In 1876, her son Abdulaziz was overthrown in a coup. Days later, he was found dead, his wrist slit. The palace claimed it was suicide. Pertevnial did not believe it. When they brought his body before her, she said nothing. Her face pale, her veil trembling, she whispered one sentence to the guards. "The fire that Hurrem lit will burn even through our tears." Her grief shook the empire. For months the court was silent. When she died, it was said that the bells of Aksaray tolled not just for her, but for an era, the last age of queens who ruled from the shadows. But history is never kind to women who shape it. In the textbooks of later years, Pertevnial's name would fade, her power forgotten in the noise of wars and politics, yet her legacy lived, the final whisper of Hurrem's fire as it struggled against the winds of decline. Then came the final chapter of empire, a time of exile, betrayal, and the death of dreams. The 20th century dawned, and with it, the end of 600 years of Ottoman rule. Sultans no longer commanded armies. They signed treaties they did not understand. The world of palaces and harems, of silk and sovereignty, was crumbling. And yet, even in its death throes, the empire produced one last daughter of Hurrem, a woman whose courage burned like a star against the darkness. Her name was Nazikeda Kadın, the last empress of the Ottomans, wife of Sultan Mehmed VI. She lived to see what no Valid Sultan before her had witnessed, the foreign invasion of Istanbul. The streets once walked by Hürrem and Kösem were now patrolled by British soldiers. The Ottoman flag, the crescent that had once ruled continents, was lowered from the palaces of the Bosphorus. Nazikeda could have fled. She could have hidden in Europe like so many of her kin. But she stayed, not for herself but for the people. When the orphans of the war cried for food, she fed them. When families fled the fighting, she opened the palace gates. And when the Sultan, broken and defeated, prepared to leave his city forever, she packed nothing of her own. Only a small chest of letters, written by the women who came before her. Among them, a single parchment, yellowed with age. On it, a quote said to be from Hurrem Sultan herself. "If the fire of power dies in our hands, may it burn in our daughters' hearts." Nazikeda read those words as she boarded the ship that would carry her away from Istanbul. Behind her, the city she had loved, her empire, her world, faded into the mist. The Ottoman dynasty was gone, but the legacy of its women, the lineage of courage and intellect, of love and rebellion, remained. Years later, when the Republic of Turkey was born from the ashes, its women began to rise. Educated, outspoken, ambitious, they built schools, led movements, and entered politics. They were the daughters of a new age, but their fire was old, ancient as Hürrem's defiance. The harem was gone, but the spirit that once ruled it had escaped its walls and entered the modern world. Hürrem's dream of a woman who could think, speak, and shape destiny was no longer a scandal. It was the foundation of a nation. Today, when the sun sets over Istanbul, the domes of Topkapi glow like dying embers. Tourists walk its courtyards, whispering of harems and sultans. But those who listen closely can still hear the echoes of 1,000 years of women's strength. The laughter of Hürrem, the counsel of Nurbanu, the wisdom of Kösem, the mercy of Besmialem, the faith of Pertevnial, the courage of Nazikeda. Together they are not ghosts. They are a flame, eternal, defiant, unyielding. And though the empire has long fallen into dust, its greatest rulers were never the men who wore the crown, but the women who kept its light alive when the world grew dark. For even in decline, fire does not die. It becomes something purer, a memory, a lesson, a spark that waits to rise again. And so it is said, that as long as there are women who dream, who fight, who endure, Hürrem's fire will never fade. It will live forever, in the embers of an empire and in the hearts of her daughters who still walk beneath the crescent moon. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If you were moved by the stories of these incredible women, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more tales from history. Until next time.